Hello, everybody, and welcome to a new episode of our liturgical series. Today's episode, this is our third take because I think I bit off a little more than I could chew. I wanted to talk about, and I will, about church architecture, but I had various topics, and I realized more and more that talking about all of them got very complicated, a little overlong, and really for a couple of the issues unnecessary. So I was going to talk, for example, on where the positioning of the choir as well as the positioning of the tabernacle, but I don't think that's something we have much trouble with in our area or in our parishes specifically. There were problems, especially in suburban parishes, with respect to those, but not so much in this area. So I'm going to leave those two topics to the side. I also wanted to talk about positioning of altars and the building of new altars, but I'm going to tie that into essentially my discussion of orientation of worship. So we'll get to that probably at either next episode or some later episode. So today I'll just limit myself really to talking about communion rails. Because I think that's a big enough topic for one episode anyway. So what we know kind of in general, the move was before the Second Vatican Council, communion rails everywhere being in use. And then after the Second Vatican Council, communion rails falling out of use, and then subsequently being removed from the churches. And really, so those are two separate things happening, right? Them going out of use had to do with kind of the common practice, the practice adopted by the American bishops being of receiving communion standing. And then the removal of the altar rails was a separate question entirely, which generally the justification given for it was that the communion rails were a barrier between the people and God, right? And we need to remove those barriers. Okay, so that was kind of the thought process, and it was all kind of referred back to the Second Vatican Council. So what actually happened with the council with this question? Well, certainly before the council, there was a requirement that communion rails be in place. At the council, there's no mention made of them whatsoever. So in terms of what the church asked for in terms of the liturgical reform, there's no mention of kind of the use of altar rails or disuse of altar rails. So it would seem that the assumption is things will just continue as before if no mention is made of it. But of course, some mention is made of the manner of receiving the Eucharist. In the general instruction, we have this line that says, "The faithful receive Holy Communion either kneeling or standing, as established by the Episcopal Conference. When receiving Holy Communion standing, however, it is recommended that the communicant make a gesture of reverence before receiving the sacrament, as established by aforementioned norms." Okay. So basically, it's opening up the possibility of receiving communion standing, right? This is not yet a question of in the hand or on the tongue, which we've talked about. Well, I guess I talked about in my homily, and which we'll probably talk about it again in an episode here. But that wasn't a question really opened up by the Second Vatican Council. The question opened up was receiving standing or kneeling. But the general preference of the church is kneeling. In places where it's decided that people will receive standing, the recommendation from the church is that some gesture of reverence, of adoration be established, and that communicants make that gesture before receiving communion. Okay, so this is still assuming communion on the tongue here, but certainly opening up to that possibility, and we know that the bishops of the United States chose to make it the standard practice in the states to receive standing. Now, that in itself did not change kind of the manner of approach towards where we receive the Eucharist. That would still be, for example, if you go to my home parish, Emmanuel in Dayton. Whether people receive kneeling or standing, they still come up to the communion rail, right? And so that wasn't, there's there's no mention of, there's no envisioning of that particular change. But this is kind of what played into that. Okay, if we're going to receive standing, then we'll just walk up in file and receive in that way. So that's kind of what ended up happening, which of course then makes it difficult for a gesture of reverence to be made before receiving the Eucharist, because you're holding up the line behind you when you're doing that, right? So there are practical difficulties that come into play with that, but in general, it was just seen that, okay, if we're generally going to receive standing, then we'll just form a line and do that. So I would say that's part of the reason also that we saw the removal of altar rails, that they were seen as unnecessary for that reason. But again, they can be used even when people are receiving the Eucharist standing. So essentially what we know of from what the Church gave us at the Second Vatican Council is there's really no mention made of altar rails at all. And then the practical application of that in the general instruction has kind of a section on kind of the arrangement, the construction of sanctuaries. And the first paragraph is the only one that mentions anything kind of resembling the communion rail. And it says, the sanctuary is the place where the altar stands, the word of God is proclaimed, and the priest, the deacon, and other ministers exercise their functions. So that's what the sanctuary is. And it should be appropriately marked off from the body of the Church, either by its being somewhat elevated or by a particular structure and ornamentation. Of course, not excluding the option of having both, right? But that it should be marked off at least in some way. Usually you see that the sanctuary is at least marked off by being raised, right? But what is this particular structure and ornamentation? Obviously in the tradition, the only structure and ornamentation that specifically marks off the sanctuary from the rest of the church is the communion rail. So I would say, that the one mention made of the communion rail here is to say that, well, there should be something marking off the sanctuary from the rest of the church. And that certainly can be, part of that can be the communion rail. Now, it is true that the communion rail was a requirement for construction of churches before the Second Vatican Council. It no longer is. So that's the essential reason why you'll see new churches built without communion rails and so on. That is allowed, right? But in no place, and this has been reiterated time and time again by for example, the prefects for the Congregation of the Clergy and the prefect for the Congregation of Divine Worship, who kind of offer answers to clarify questions of this sort, repeatedly have said, like, at no point did Rome ask for the removal of communion rails. And in fact, the removal of them, this has been mentioned by various authorities in the church, that the removal of them was the result really of a mistaken notion. Again, there's nothing in the documents asking for their removal, but there was a move to remove them because they were, the main reason they were seen as a barrier between the people and God. And of course, that was never the intention of their symbolism. And I suspect that that interpretation of them was brought in by those who simply wanted to remove them and kind of place that interpretation upon them themselves. But really, what is the actual symbolism behind the communion rail? Well, there's various things. First of all, it is marking the separation between the sanctuary and the nave, so between that which is sacred and that which is not. Which is not to say that there's nothing good on this side and it's totally blocked off from what is good on this side. That's not it at all, but it is to say this area is dedicated to one purpose, and that one purpose is the worship of God. That's the idea behind consecration. It's setting something apart for the worship of God. And so that rail is one of the ways which we mark off a specific place for the worship of God, right? So this idea of dedicating things to the worship of God is very common, right? And it's the reason for the communion rail. It's also the reason for why we keep sacred vessels in a different place, right? We don't use coffee mugs to consecrate the Eucharist in. We use a chalice, which is only ever used for that purpose, right? Because this is set apart. This is only for the worship of God. That idea of consecrating, of setting apart, goes back to our Jewish roots, right? And has continued throughout the history of the church. It was not a medieval innovation. It is totally in line with how God has led us to turn towards him and to offer worship to him throughout the ages, right? So this idea of setting apart is not a way of saying, okay, we're blocking off, but rather of saying we need to recognize that this is worthy of dedicating something only to this purpose, and that any other use is kind of prevented for this, in this case, for this area, for this space. And we see that, we see that kind of playing out in places that have removed the altar rails, that there is a loss of that sense, right? That especially, you see children running up and down the sanctuary like it's a playground, and it's like, well, they're children. They don't understand that, and that's, you can't be angry at them, but what are we teaching them, right? What are we teaching them if this is just a playground to them, right? This is really something reserved to the worship of God, and here there's nothing to pull our minds to that, right? As soon as we remove that communion rail. And so there is a definite purpose to having it there, despite the fact that, it's not built all the way to the edge of the church. If you look at the old pictures of our communion rails in our churches, for example, you can easily get around it. There's gates opening up that you can come through. And obviously anybody could hurdle it. So it's not like it's there to block off something. It's there just to show that delineation of this area is reserved to the worship of God in a particular way. Okay, so that's one of the symbolic meanings of the rail. Another way of looking at it really is kind of that line where heaven meets earth, right? Because we certainly believe at the Mass we're entering into the presence of God, and we're entering into that act of sacrifice which Christ undertook on behalf of all of us, that we're allowed to enter into that act, which continues eternally in the Holy of Holies, which is heaven, the presence of God, right? And this is very much in connection with the Holy of Holies in the temple, right? That would have been separated off as well. So we have that understanding here that at the Mass we're allowed a glimpse of the life of heaven, and that's not that's something that we receive under liturgical signs now, and it's something we hope for the full reality of only in heaven. And yet we recognize that we're entering into something beyond anything else on earth, right? And so we delineate that this is kind of the place where heaven meets earth, and there's a line where that happens. There's a place where that happens. And kind of in connection with that, the altar rail is seen also as a continuation of the altar, or so you'll see it being constructed with the same materials as the altar, similar motifs to the altar, kind of to emphasize that the communion rail in a sense represents the altar, so that when you come to it, it's like you're coming to the altar, you're coming to the table of the Lord to receive the Lord, and the Lord meets us there. And that line of meeting, that table, which the communion rail represents, is like that place where heaven enters into the life of earth, right? When we receive Christ, we're receiving the person of Jesus Christ is heaven itself, right? So that when we receive Christ, heaven is entering into our earthly reality, and we're called to then bring that out into the world, right? Very much a theme of the Second Vatican Council. And the communion rail is kind of the place where heaven enters into that life of earth, and we're called to then go out and take what we have received from this holy place, and bring it out into the whole world. And so that's really the symbolism of the communion rail. In no way is it meant to be like an impassable barrier between people and God, so that only the priest is close to. Nothing like that. Nothing like that. Quite the contrary, in fact. And so, just looking at what the church has said on this, it becomes very clear. It was never the intention of the church to remove these. It's with great sadness that we look back on the fact that in most places they were removed. But there is still great symbolic value to them in places where they remain, or in new constructions in which they are placed. So it's something to keep in mind, certainly, as we move forward, that this is one of those changes that was not asked for by the council, but unfortunately taken on by many within the church despite that fact.